Hello, students. This is chapter 32, a macroeconomic theory of the open economy. In this chapter, we will be linking domestic loanable funds market with the real exchange rate or the foreign exchange rate market. The questions we seek to answer here are in an open economy, what determines the real interest rate, the real exchange rate? How are the markets for loanable funds and foreign currency exchange connected? How do government budget deficits affect the exchange rate and trade balance? How do other policies or events affect the interest rate, exchange rate, and the trade balance? In previous chapter, we looked at the basic concepts and the vocabulary of the open economy. We defined net exports, net capital outflow, and exchange rates. In this chapter, the theory of the open economy, we see how government policies and various events affect the trade balance, exchange rate, and capital flows. Let's look at the market for loanable funds. In an open economy, national savings is equal to domestic investment or I plus NCO or net capital outflow. Supply of loanable funds come from national savings, and demand for loanable funds come from domestic investment and net capital outflow. When net capital outflow is positive or NCO greater than zero, there is a net outflow of capital. There's a net purchases of capital overseas, and it adds to the demand for domestically generated loanable funds. When NCO is negative, there is a net inflow of capital, that is, capital resources coming from abroad, and reduce the demand for domestically generated loanable funds. How NCO depends on real interest rate. The real interest rate, R, is the real return on domestic assets. And as a fall in R makes domestic assets less attractive relative to foreign assets. People in the US purchase more foreign assets. People abroad purchase fewer US assets. Symbolically, you can see that a decline in R, a decline in interest rate, leads to an increase in NCO, which means an outflow of funds. Capital flows overseas to find better return if domestic interest rate is low. This is a market for loanable funds. Supply is national savings, and demand for loanable funds is domestic investment plus NCO. On the horizontal axis measures the loanable funds, and the vertical axis, the interest rate. And interest rate are adjust to balance supply and demand in the loanable funds market. The first active learning, the effect of budget deficits and capital flows. Suppose the government runs a budget deficit, which previously was balanced. Use appropriate diagrams to determine the effect of real interest rate and net outflow. This is the transmission mechanism. In the next slide, we're going to see this in graphical form. BD for budget deficit leads to a decrease in national savings or a decrease in supply of loanable funds. The supply curve shifts to the left, and this leads to an increase in interest rate. Real interest rate goes up, and when real interest rate goes up, it attracts foreign capital. There is a decrease in net capital outflow. This means capital is flowing inwards or inflow of capital. Let's see that in graphical form. This is the loanable funds market is in equilibrium, and NCO is pulled away from demand and is put in a graph by itself, net capital outflow. And a budget deficit reduces savings, sorry, a budget deficit reduces savings and the supply of loanable funds, causing a rise in interest rate. So that is a left shift of the supply curve of loanable funds. This left shift will lead to an increase in interest rate, and that increase in interest rate will lead to a decrease in loanable fund, in NCO, sorry. Higher R makes US bonds more attractive relative to foreign bonds. There's a capital inflow. When NCO is negative, it means there's a capital inflow to take advantage of the higher interest rate domestically. When working with this model, keep in mind that the loanable funds market determines R, which is the interest rate. That is in this graph here. This is where interest rate is determined. Then this value of interest rate determines NCO, or net capital outflow. When interest rate is high, there is inflow of capital. When interest rate declines, there is outflow of capital. Foreign exchange currency. Foreign exchange. The market for foreign currency exchange, let's start with an identity. Net capital outflow is equal to net exports. Net exports is the demand for dollars. Foreigners need dollars to buy US net exports. NCO is the supply of dollars. US residents sell dollars to obtain the foreign currency they need to buy foreign assets. The US real exchange rate, uppercase E, measures the quantity of foreign goods and services that trade for 1 unit of US goods and services. E is the real value of a dollar in the market for foreign currency exchange. And this is the market for the dollar. An increase in E makes US goods more expensive to foreigners and reduces foreign demand for US goods. That means the dollar appreciates. When real exchange rate increases, the dollar appreciates and US goods are expensive. I might add that foreign goods are cheaper, so as exports decline, imports will increase. An increase in E has no effect on saving or investment, so it does not affect NCO or the supply of dollars. E adjusts to balance supply and demand for dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange. Disentangling supply and demand. When US residents buy imported goods, that is, imports, does the transaction affect supply or demand in the foreign exchange market? There are two views about this that are identical to each other. The supply of dollars increase. The person needs to sell her dollars to obtain the foreign currency she needs to buy the imports. So there's an increase in the supply of the dollars. This view can also be interpreted as the demand for dollars decrease. The increase in imports reduces net exports, which we think of as the demand for dollars. So NX is really a net demand for dollars. Both views are equivalent. For our purposes here, it is more convenient to use this second one. On the other hand, when foreigners buy US goods, that is US exports, buy US assets, does the transaction affect supply or demand in the foreign exchange market? Like the previous example, there are two views to this. It can be looked at as the demand for dollars increase. The foreigner needs dollars in order to purchase the US assets. It can also be looked at as the supply of the dollar falls. The transaction reduces NCO, which we think of as the supply of dollars. So NCO is really the net supply of dollars. And again, both views are equivalent. We will use the second. Active learning 2, budget deficit, exchange rate, and net export. Initially, the government budget is balanced and trade is balanced. Net export is zero and government budget is also balanced. Tax is equal to government spending. Suppose the government runs a budget deficit, as we saw in earlier. Interest rate rises, and NCO falls. How does the budget deficit affect the US real exchange rate? What about the balance of trade? Okay. The budget deficit reduces NCO and the supply of the dollars. The real exchange rate appreciates, reducing the net exports. And since net export is equal to zero initially, the budget deficit causes a trade deficit, which symbolically we can see that what is really happening here in this transmission mechanism. Budget deficit, as we have seen earlier, reduces the supply of the dollar. So, no, I beg your pardon, supply of the loanable funds. In the loanable funds market, the supply curve shifts to the left. This leads to an increase in interest rate. An increase in interest rate leads to inflow of foreign asset, inflow of foreign money into the country. This is an inflow. When NCO declines, it is an inflow. This leads to a decline in supply of the dollar. Decline, this is an arrow pointing down, in the supply of the dollar. This will lead to an increase in real exchange rate. And when real exchange rate goes up, exports will decline, imports will increase, and there is a decline in net export. By definition, this is trade deficit. So we can see how budget deficit leads straight to trade deficit. TD here is trade deficit. And this is the transmission mechanism that explains that. Summary. The effect of a budget deficit is summarized here. National savings falls, that is a left shift of the supply curve. Real interest rate rises or increases. Domestic investment and net capital outflow falls, decline in net capital outflow and domestic investment. That is, NCO is negative. Real exchange rate appreciates. A decline in the supply of the dollar increase leads to an increase in real exchange rate, and net export falls, and it leads to a decline in net exports. So this is a good summary of the effect of budget deficit. Other effects: as foreigners acquire more domestic assets, the country's debt to the rest of the world increases. Due to many years of budget and trade deficits, the US is now the world's largest debtor nation. As of June 30th, 2016, the value of US owned foreign assets is $31.6 trillion. The value of foreign owned US assets is $24.1 trillion. US net debt to the rest of the world is $7.5 trillion. Hence, US is the largest debtor nation. Connection between interest rate and exchange rate. Anything that increases interest rate will reduce NCO, and the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market. Result, the real exchange rate appreciates. Keep in mind the loanable funds market, which is not shown here, determines interest rate. And it is the interest rate that determines NCO. This value of NCO then determines the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market. Suppose government provides new tax incentives to encourage investment. Use the appropriate diagrams to determine how this policy would affect real interest rate, net capital outflow, real exchange rate, and net exports. This is the transmission here from an increase in demand. When government provides new tax incentives to encourage investment, demand for loanable funds will increase, leading to a right shift of the demand for loanable funds. This will lead to an increase in interest rate, which, as we have seen, will lead to a decrease in net capital outflow, which will lead to a decrease in the supply of the dollars, which will increase exchange rate. Real exchange rate will increase, and it will lead to trade deficit or net export will decline. This is the answer that we just showed in symbols. Investment and the demand for loanable funds increase at each hour. That is the demand, a right shift of the demand curve for loanable funds. This right shift will lead to an interest rate increasing. Okay. And interest rate increasing will determine net capital outflow. In other words, there's going to be an inflow of capital. The fall in NCO reduces the supply of the dollars. Let me put it back again. The fall in NCO reduces the supply of the dollars in the foreign exchange market. And that decrease in the supply of the dollar will lead to an increase in real exchange rates. In other words, the dollar will appreciate in value. When the dollar appreciates in value, our exports decline, imports will increase, and net export will decrease. The real exchange rate appreciates, reducing net exports. Budget deficits versus investment incentives. A tax incentive for investment that we've just seen has a similar effect as a budget deficit. They both lead to trade deficit. In other words, interest rises, NCO falls, exchange rate rises, and NX falls. But one important difference, investment tax incentives increases investment, which increases productivity growth and living standards in the long run. Whereas a budget deficit reduces investment, which reduces productivity growth and living standards. This is something we call the crowding out. Budget deficit crowd out domestic private investment. All right. What about trade policy? Let's look at trade policy. Government policy that directly influences the quantity of goods and services a country imports, like tariff, which is a tax on imports, import quota, a limit on the quantity of imports, voluntary export restraint. The government pressures another country to restrict its exports, essentially the same effect as import quotas. Common reasons for policies that restrict trade, restrict import, would be to save jobs in a domestic industry that has difficulty competing with imports, reduce trade deficit. Question is, do such trade policies accomplish these goals? Let's examine them. Analysis of a quota on cars from Japan. Okay, let's say United States imposes a quota on cars imported from Japan. An import quota does not affect savings or investment, so it does not affect NCO. Recall that NCO is equal to savings minus or supply of loanable funds minus investment. So the market that is left is market for foreign currency exchange. Since NCO is unchanged, supply curve does not shift. The demand curve shifts at each exchange level, at each foreign currency exchange. Import of cars fall, so net exports will rise. Can't import any more cars from Japan, so net exports will rise. Demand shifts to the right. At at E1, there is excess demand in foreign exchange market. Demand has shifted to the right. This is demand for the dollar has shifted to the right. E will rise, exchange rate will rise to restore equilibrium. The dollar will appreciate in value. What happens to net export? Nothing. If exchange rate could remain at E, net exports would rise and the quantity of dollars demanded would rise. But the import quota does not affect NCO, so the quantity of dollars supplied is fixed. And since net export must equal NCO, exchange rate must rise enough to keep NX at its original level. Hence, the policy of restricting imports does not reduce trade deficit. It's a self-defeating policy. Does the policy save jobs? Well, let us examine this. The quota reduces imports of Japanese cars. US consumers buy more US cars, they have no choice. US automakers hire more workers to produce these cars. Okay, so the policy saves jobs in the US auto industry. Good things. However, this will lead to an increase in exchange rate. The dollar will appreciate. When the dollar appreciates, it will reduce foreign demand for US exports. US exports will decline. Foreigners can't afford made in America because it's expensive. Export industries contract, exporting firms lay off workers. The import quota saves jobs in the auto industry but destroys jobs in US export industries. So it is, and again, a self defeating policy. Let's look at capital flows from China. In recent years, China has accumulated US assets. China's foreign assets from 2000 to 2012 increased from $160 billion to $4 trillion, including US government bonds, to reduce its exchange rate and boost its exports. This results in the US appreciation of the dollar relative to the Chinese currency renminbi, higher US imports from China. The dollar is strong, so Americans import from China, and a larger trade deficit. Let's examine the political instability and its effect on capital. In 1994, political instability in Mexico made world financial markets nervous. People worried about the safety of Mexican assets they owned. People sold many of these assets, pulled their capital out of Mexico. We call that capital flight, which is a large and sudden reduction in the demand for assets located in a country. This is how it works. if there is an increase in the NCO will shift to the right. Okay, if foreign investors sell their assets and pull out the capital, that is NCO increases at each value of dollar. In other words, there is a right shift of the NCO. This right shift will lead to a right shift of demand for loanable funds. Since remember, NCO is part of this demand. So the demand for loanable funds will shift to the right, which will raise interest rate. Okay, the equilibrium value of interest will increase and NCO will increase. Outflow of NCO or net capital outflow. This is what happens symbolically. And a right shift of net capital outflow, this just means the NCO will shift to the right, and this will lead to a right shift of the demand for loanable funds. This is from Mexico's point of view. Okay, this is the currency flowing out of assets flowing out of Mexico. This will lead to increase in demand for loanable funds in Mexico. This will lead to Mexican interest rate rising and NCO flowing out. This is capital outflow, increase in NCO. This will lead to increase in the supply of the peso. This is a right shift of the supply of the peso, which will lead to a decline in the exchange rate or a depreciation of the peso. That is capital flight in Mexico in 1994. You can see the value of the peso collapsed at that point. We can also see capital flight in South Korea, in Indonesia, and several other countries. Capital flight from Russia in 1998 had pretty much the same effect. Capital flight from Argentina in the early 2000s. Ask the experts. Currency manipulation. Economic analysis can identify whether countries are using their exchange rates to benefit their own people at the expense of their trading partners. What do economists think? 34 disagree, 36 are uncertain, and 30 agree. In conclusion, the US economy is becoming increasingly open. Trade in goods and services is rising relative to GDP. Increasingly, people hold in national assets in their portfolios, and firms finance investment with foreign capital. Yet we should be careful not to blame our problems on the international economy. Our trade deficit is not caused by other countries' quote unquote unfair trade practices, but by our own low savings. Stagnant living standards are not caused by imports, but by low productivity growth here in the United States. In summary, two markets are central to the macroeconomics of the open economy. The market for loanable funds, the real interest rate adjusts to balance the supply of loanable funds uh, and the demand for loanable funds. The market for foreign currency exchange, the real exchange rate adjusts to balance the supply of dollars from NCO and the demand for dollars from NX. NCO connects these two markets. A policy that reduces national saving, such as a government budget deficit, reduces the supply of loanable funds and drives up interest rates. The higher interest rate reduces net capital outflow, which reduces the supply of dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange. The dollar appreciates, and the net exports fall. When investors change their attitudes about holding assets of a country, political instability can lead to capital flight, which tends to increase interest rates and cause currency to depreciate. A trade restriction increases net exports for any given exchange rate and therefore increases the demand for dollars in the market for foreign currency. The dollar appreciates in value, making domestic goods more expensive relative to foreign goods. This appreciation offset the initial impact of the trade restriction on net exports. And that ends the lecture.